So first, I want to say, give a huge thank you to Mike, to Christy, and also to Andy Wilson, who is a co-founder of Innovate Pasadena, for introducing me to these folks, and and to all the organizers for having me here today. A little bit about myself. Okay. A little bit about myself. I do business development now. It's my first go at BD. I've spent the rest of my career in engineering in various capacities, from process engineering all the way to VP of engineering for various companies. And I've worked at large companies in automotive as well as startups. The first startup I worked at, we built an ocular drug pump that implants on the eye and pumps drugs into the back of your eye for retinal diseases. And we took that from essentially a PhD thesis, which is a really advanced form of a napkin sketch in some ways, to all the way to clinical trials. So when we talk about commercializing technology, what do we really mean by that? And I like this graph. I learned this in college from Professor Antonsen at Caltech. And at the beginning, you have a lot of design freedom, the red line on the top left there. Because you've essentially got a blank page. On the other hand, you don't know very much about the problem you're trying to solve. But by the time you're done, you have no design freedom because you've got to either do the demo to your investor or you've got to launch it and sell it to customers. And you have all this knowledge that you can do nothing with. So how do you manage past this kind of dichotomy? And the other thing that I want to mention is that this talk isn't really an engineering lecture per se. Really what I want to get at is what is the connection between product development and engineering and the business? Because at the end of the day, unless you're in academia or maybe a research lab at a huge company, you're really serving the business in some way. And you've really got to understand how what you do as an engineer or the technical staff serves the business that you're in. Really, at the end of the day, I want to talk about the things that I see other people and the things that I wish I would have known at the beginning of these product development journeys. So I'm going to start here, with this sort of list, and I'm going to start with failures, right? Because learning from failure is often as good as, maybe better than, learning from successes. The first is market failure, when you build something that market doesn't want. Examples of this, you can think back to the auto industry for those of you who remember back far enough, in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s, the American automakers were making not fuel efficient, not high quality cars, and the Japanese were coming in and building what customers wanted. So it's a matter of market. Using the same kind of analogy, 100 years ago, if you were building the most amazing horse-drawn buggy, you're probably in a losing company, right? Customers. A lot of people don't build what customers want, and a lot of people think about these two as sort of the same thing. What I would say is that they're not quite the same thing, because if you remember BlackBerry around 10 years ago, it was all the rage, right? We were all carrying around crackberries, but then the iPhone came in at a lower spec. If you looked at the spec sheets for BlackBerry and iPhone was actually a little bit less good than BlackBerry. But we all know what happened in history. The iPhone absolutely destroyed the BlackBerry in the market. And that's really because BlackBerry didn't understand that people didn't want just all the features. They wanted a beautiful user interface. And that grandma, wanted something that she could figure out how to use. And I say that because I bought my mom an iPhone, just to be clear. The third is product definition. So a lot of people, they figure out what they're going to build, or they think they've figured out what they're going to build, but it's all in their head. They don't write it down. So, and I get this experience sometimes because I'll sit in a conference room with an entrepreneur, and I'm like, well, what do you want me to quote you? Do you have a document? They're like, no, it's all up here. And so I'll sit with them for hours and sketch it on the whiteboard and get them a quote and say, well, to make what you want to make, it's going to take this long, it's going to cost this much. The reason this is important, particularly in medical devices, is because, the FDA requires it, that's one thing, but it's really best practice, and as you expand your team, you can't depend on them to read your mind. What's shocking, though, is how many companies don't bother to really write down what they're trying to build. Both the large companies as well as the entrepreneurs. This is not a dig at entrepreneurs. It happens in big companies, too. The last two is where I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of the talk. Scalability, meaning that if you build one, you might be able to, impress some friends, maybe even get an investor. But if you can't build a whole bunch of them, unless your whole company is built around building one thing and selling it, I mean, this doesn't count, I guess. But But otherwise, you're going to be kind of up the creek, as it were, if you can't build the things that people want to buy. And then I put team here last because I saved the best for last. Really, you have to think about the team you're going to build, because the team is what's going to help you solve everything above. I told you I was going to spend most of the time on the last two, so I'm going to solve all your problems in the first three in one slide. And the reason is because, this slide here kind of communicates the sort of measure twice part of the measure twice, cut once idea. You got to there's books. I mean, these three categories or subjects, you could build an entire library with books just from these three, right? That's covered really, really well. You can pick the book. You can almost like throw a dart, hit the book, and then use that because they're all workable ways to do it. There's a million ways to do these things, and it's up to you to adapt to the ones that you pick and to adapt and then adapt the thing you pick to what you're doing, whether it's understanding the market or the customers or doing essentially systems engineering when you're doing product definition. I will say one thing very quickly about the market customer piece of it, and that is that, if you're out there asking customers what they want, the next question you have to ask them is why. Because, a lot of people, like Henry Ford used to say, if I ask customers what they wanted, they want a faster horse, right? Well, what do they really want? The best example of that, by the way, is point-and-shoot cameras. For those of you who are old enough to remember those, they used to come out with these cameras that, bigger lenses and light sensors and all this stuff, all these features, because that's what customers said they wanted. But Fuji's the only one who asked, why do you want these features? And at the end of the day, what people really wanted is, I want to take a not crappy photo without having to learn to be a photographer. And so they created this point-and-shoot camera, became the laughingstock of the industry at first, but then won the day in the market. So on to scaling. And I think the first thing you want to talk about is, when do you start thinking about it? Because a lot of people, they'll say, well, maybe we start thinking about it here, or maybe we start thinking about it here, or worse yet, let's start thinking about it when we have to scale, because we've sold 1 million of these and now we've got to go make them. That's the absolute worst time to scale. The answer really, from experience as well as from the literature, is to start here. The best example of that I can think of is the transistor. So everyone knows, everyone has transistors. You have transistors in your toaster, for crying out loud, right? But William Shockley invented it at Bell Laboratories, roughly 50 years ago. Well, his team did, actually. And then he looked at the work his team did and said, all your work is crap. He was not a very nice guy. And so he reinvented the transistor, and the reason he did it was because he felt that his team did not take into account manufacturability. Because if they were going to go field it, and put it out into the market, you couldn't just build one. And you certainly couldn't hire 1 million PhDs from Caltech to build them one at a time. So here are basically 5 sort of ideas for you to take away from here about how to scale. Your first is your design requirements versus manufacturing capability. So if you design something where you can't have it made, you're kind of in trouble. You got to figure out how to make it. That also means that you're designing the product and the process basically at the same time. And the reason is on the third bullet, is that when you're actually making product design decisions, you're already designing the process. Whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, you're actually already constraining your manufacturing process. If you design it this way, you can machine it, but you can't injection mold it. If you design it that way, you can injection mold it, but you can't machine it. If you design it this third way, you have to 3D print it. You can't injection mold or machine it. And that implies cost. It implies the ability to scale or not. And so you really want to do this simultaneously, and you want to think about it as a holistic process rather than, I'm going to design the thing, then I'm going to make the thing, and then I'm going to produce more of the thing. It's all one sort of kit and caboodle. And it's one kit and caboodle whether you like it or not, so you might as well be intentional. If you're not intentional about it enough, or if you are, depending on how smart you are, I guess, process could be a product. So if you think about Intel and the journey they've taken us on, that Moore's Law, right? Every 18 months, transistor density doubles, right? They have 2 projects for every chip they build or they design. They have one project to design the chip, and they have another project, and each of these is billions of dollars, to design the manufacturing process. Because you've heard this maybe in the media, right? You go, oh, we have a 20 nanometer process, we have a 15, a 13. Now they're at like something like 9 nanometer processes, so they can make really tiny features. But it's multiple billions to design your process to make your product. And if that's what you want to sign up for because that's what gives you a competitive advantage, great. But don't do that by accident because you'll be out a lot of money. The last is just a very quick comment. Think statistically. This particularly applies to folks who really like to build widgets at home and that kind of thing. And they're like, oh, I got one to work. The question isn't whether you got that one to work. The question is what does that one you got to work tell you about the million that you have to build later? And there's classes and there's books and there's people who can help you understand what the 3 or 5 or a dozen things you've built tells you about the million and what it doesn't tell you. And lastly, we have teaming. And like I said, I put this last because this is the thing I want you to leave with, right? This is what is going to help you get past all the other 4 things. The team is the most important thing. It's the number 1, the number 2, and number 3 thing that your investors are going to look at when they evaluate you. Then comes the market, then comes technology. So when you think about it, because this talk is really aimed at a technology company, right, in medical devices or otherwise, you have to think about what's available, what you can acquire, and what you have to develop. And you want to make these decisions deliberately. There's a lot of people, when they start companies, they get funding, they feel like, I don't have that much money, so I'm going to develop everything. I'm a mechanical engineer, I'm going to go learn EE and try to design a circuit board. That kind of thing. That's okay, but only if you're making that decision very deliberately and strategically. One thing I find most people have a really easy time with is pawning off the work they really hate doing. So, it's true, though. So engineers are like, oh, I don't know anything about HR. I'm going to go hire somebody for that. I don't know. I'm not an attorney. I'm going to go hire an IP attorney. I don't know anything about finance. I'm going to hire an accountant. That's easy because they don't really want to do it in the first place. But really what I want you to think about is, how about the stuff that you think you're good at? How are you going to delegate those responsibilities to other people and build a team, not just a team of your buddies, your lab mates or whatever, but a team that can do all the things around scaling, around commercialization, around marketing, around market access to help your company. And you got to then decide whether you're going to learn it or someone in your company is going to learn it or whether you're going to hire it in or whether you're going to outsource it, that kind of thing. When you do that, and when you hire people and when you build your team, you've got to look for that strategic fit, right? You don't want to be the startup calling up Panasonic asking for help designing something, because Panasonic doesn't care about you, and they never will until you become that billion-dollar customer. So you've got to pick your vendors, your employees, and everybody who you work with in a strategic way, and not just people that you like because you worked with them in the lab or whatever. And you got to remember also that others will pick you. It's kind of like dating or making friends. You don't always get a unilateral choice, right? You might really like somebody, they might not like you. But it works on the flip side too, right? I've worked with one vendor who, we've worked on a couple ophthalmology projects together, and part of the reason he works with me is because, I bring him business that's really small, not a lot of money, but it's for veterans and it's for injured troops. And so the head of business development at that company is really happy to work with me because I bring him projects that he really cares about, that his company really supports. And so they're able to give us support even though, frankly, in every other way, we're a horrible match for each other because I'm not bringing him a lot of business. I'm not getting him volume. But what I am getting him is a project that could turn into volume one day, an insight into what's happening in ophthalmology at the cutting edge. And then, of course, he was a Navy vet, so he's very much interested in helping me. So that works kind of both ways, and you might have to find that area of common ground that's more human than it is technical. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. Now my understanding it's going to be Q&A. I've got to switch mics here.
Yeah, I got you. Okay. Thank you, Evan. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
That was actually super concise and super informative. A lot of great practical tips on designing. Designing for prototype and designing for manufacturing is a horrible transfer. If you've ever gone through it, you know it's very difficult. Before we hand this to Q&A, we're going to have John take the mic. If you got a question, raise your hand. Let's stick to questions. So this is a great time to ask about design process, manufacturing processes, the thinking behind it. Not a great time to pitch your company and what you're trying to work on right now. And actually, can you give us a little bit more background in what you've been doing in automotive, and because you've actually got a pretty intense background that you didn't get to share with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. So I spent about 9 years building body shops for General Motors. If you've driven a Buick Enclave or a Chevy Traverse, I'm starting to lose track of all the different vehicles. The GMC Acadia, I built the factory that builds those. For those of you who are car enthusiasts, the Chevy SSR is like a little convertible pickup truck, a very, very niche product for sure. The Chevy Cruze, small car like a Civic. But now I work for Leap Biomed Innovators, and what we do is we have a clean room. We have two clean rooms, actually. We have one for MEMS processing, which is like nanotech processing, and then we have another one that builds implantable devices. And so what we do is we help companies get from napkin to doing engineering and getting you through those scaling challenges. In terms of my background that prepared me for this job, I worked on an ophthalmic drug pump. I worked at a company called Beckman Coulter. For those of you who are familiar with the Caltech campus, there's like 4 buildings, I want to say, that have Beckman's name on it. So I worked for the sort of endpoint of that company. It is now part of Danaher Corp. And so I worked in quality and regulatory affairs for clinical chemistry, and they build these big machines that when you get your blood drawn and they send it to the lab, I mean, as far as you know, it's like a black hole, right? But then your doctor says, hey, we got the results back from the lab. So we made the machines that provide those answers to the doctors. So I spent 4 years doing that. And then the ophthalmic drug pump, it came out of a PhD thesis, or a couple of PhD theses from Caltech and USC. And as I mentioned, I was a program director, by the way, so I would manage the engineering of the pump. But yeah, it's implanted on the sort of outer corner of your eye. You have a muscle here and a muscle here, and it gets implanted there. And then you have 2 chambers in your eye: the front chamber, which contains your lens, and then the back chamber, which contains the retina. And this would inject drugs into the back of the eye for things like age-related macular degeneration, diabetic macular edema, and a couple of other indications. So that's my background.
Question first, back here. Thank you, Evan, very much for a really great outline of a great talk. I wish it was 2 hours. I'm in software, so everything you're talking about is directly applicable to large-scale software endeavors, in particular artificial intelligence. But that often takes convincing when I'm working with partners. Like, they don't understand how much design thinking has to go into the entire sort of manufacturing process. Do you have reference material that you could share with us, or case studies where you've gone through the hard decision on how we make a design choice here, like your example of machining versus mold injecting? I would love to see something completely drawn out with some case studies and more analysis around it, if you have stuff that you could share.
So software is like my weak spot.
No, just the manufacturing side is fine.
Are you referring to the software that runs the manufacturing, or?
I'm sorry, I'm unclear. I'm thinking the whole case study of how you make these design decisions at every point, from market all the way, like you said, from napkin to production. I'd like to see good reference material on that. Maybe some articles or analysis of case studies of how it was done, choices that were made at any particular point.
Yeah, where I would go for that is textbooks, to be honest with you, because they'll talk through at a sort of conceptual level on how to get through all that. If you want to get in touch with me, I can point you in the direction of folks who have worked on software and can walk you through that. But in terms of my understanding and my own reading, I don't have a lot of expertise in scaling software, to be perfectly honest. But I can point you to people who've had that experience. So I'm sorry that that.
Considering manufacturing as an analogy for software, don't worry about it.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Question back.
You were talking about failure as an opportunity to learn. Could you provide some examples of failures that you were able to learn from, and what growth that provided?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned statistics, a couple slides ago, thinking statistically, and one of the things that you do when you're working on projects where you have a widget and you're trying to test its reliability is you've got to test a whole bunch of things, and you've got to test them for a certain amount of time, and then that implies that implies statistically anyway a certain level of performance in your final product, and as well as a confidence level, so you know what chance you have of your experiment actually telling you the wrong thing. In terms of concrete examples, when we were developing the ophthalmic drug pump, we would put individual components into test rigs, and then we would sit there and exercise them over and over and over again. So, for example, there's a joint that would break, right? And then we'd be like, oh, well, why did this joint break? It broke on 1 out of 13 or 2 out of 13 parts, which tells us that if you scale that to 1 million, right, you've got a huge problem, right? I mean, think about it, if 1 out of 13 PlayStations failed, right? You couldn't find a building to fit them all in. So then we go into, well, why did it break, and what's the physics of the failure, and what can we do to design it differently so that we can get that joint to not break, right? They do this in automobiles, they do this in aircraft. With medical devices, clearly, it's like very, very important to do. Yeah. So is that a reasonable example? Okay.
Back here.
Hi, great talk. I love your emphasis on teams, and one thing in particular is team fit. At previous talks, we've heard about complementary skills, like someone with a PhD and a person in manufacturing, that kind of thing. For personality team fit, I was wondering, when you get those people together, how do you iron out the differences, or is that just a thing where you just don't hire people where the personalities are maybe not matching up great when they do have those skills?
So the way that I've dealt with that in the past is always to try to have someone on the team who can facilitate as well. I mean, there's a book out there called The No A-Hole Rule. So I think that is a very good. I mean, it's a great rule. What can I say, right? But it's true though, because that one sort of caustic bad person can bring morale down for the whole team. Just because every meeting they're being super negative or they're being insulting, even worse, right? So there is something to be said for not hiring people who are toxic, right? But let's pretend that's not what you're necessarily asking about, because I think you're not. There's a tension between, for example, the PhD and, say, a manufacturing person, and sometimes that tension is very healthy. And so the question is if you've got that facilitator on the team, how does that facilitator sort of broker that peace and get the two parties to understand each other's point of view? So having that facilitator can often be very, very important. Or having two people, if there is no facilitator, making sure that the makeup of your team are folks who are willing to intently listen to one another. Because when you talk about that PhD, and I've had a significant amount of experience with PhDs who are who are commercializing. The skill sets are very different, and when you try to describe another world to them, it's like, imagine like you're a college kid, right, trying to describe what college is like to a high school kid, right? So those of you who've have the privilege of going to college and all that, it's like impossible to describe. Or if you've been a parent, trying to describe to a non-parent what it's like to be a parent, like there's no words. There are just no words. But at the same time, the challenge really in the company is how to get that kind of discussion going, where the person on the receiving end is intently listening and willing to relinquish some level of control because they trust the other person to get it done for them, right? So those are the sort of 2 or 3 things that I would say.
Right here.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's a very good presentation. I'm based in Bay Area, in Palo Alto, for almost 30 years. So the first time I joined it, and I'm thinking about it, probably expand the business to LA. I think what he's saying is very good, but I think the most important issue difference is the culture difference. Because in Silicon Valley, I tell you, Silicon Valley, actually the culture is very unique, because we have a developer company, we have a design company, we have a planning company, and also we have a consulting company. In Silicon Valley, the employee is very expensive, but a consultant is very cheap. So sometimes if you face some issues there, just pay the check $1,000 to hire somebody to help me review my stuff there, rather than you can say my employee do the job for 1 week. No, Yeah, and the question is in basically is really when you start a company, when you're talking about all this issue there, the question is really ask yourself, you want to make money or you want to make innovation? They're totally different. Sometimes you make money, you don't need the high tech. Okay, do I? Yeah. So okay, you ask me to exactly the questions there. So when you say how to make money, how to make innovation, all these are different, are totally different. So the question is, okay, if you ask me to ask questions, okay, all this stuff actually is optimized for how to make innovation, right? Not to make how to make money.
No, I disagree.
Okay.
And here's why. Because I start with the market, right? You're only here if you've already understood what the market is willing to pay for, right? And this fundamentally helps you make money because scalability is where you get your cost. And if you don't know how to get scale and cost, you're not going to be able to sell to the market at the price that you want and make money, right? And that's why these are important. And then, of course, your team is going to help you understand how to do this and all the other things. So scalability is absolutely key to making money, right? That's my answer.
Next question over here.
So I'm a former computer engineer who got stuck in manufacturing as my first job. So I totally feel you. So just real quick, anybody who is interested in what Brian was asking about how to use manufacturing as an analogy, I would suggest study what Toyota does. Do you agree? Because they do amazing manufacturing, but they also do really amazing innovation, and they use the same processes, sort of the scientific method. And the No Assholes Rule is written by Bob Sutton, and he writes a really good blog, and he's at Stanford Engineering School. So check him out. So anyway, question. So I work with a lot of this is interesting. So I work with a lot of young entrepreneurs, let's say, inexperienced entrepreneurs, often scientists, the stereotypical PhD, and they don't know manufacturing, they don't know business. And one of the most effective things I've found is giving them examples of failure. Like specific things. These guys did this and they failed. And 17 other people did the same thing and they failed. And that seems to convince them. So can you share any examples with this group about, kind of consistent failure modes that you've seen with scientist entrepreneurs?
Yeah, sure. I want to make a comment on your, the lean bit. Out there's this agile methodology, and they use Kanban to process tickets and whatnot for software. So my wife is in software and in IT, and so I know a little bit from her, but it's just one of these things that I'm not, frankly, it's not my domain. But yeah, I think that's a great. I think that's a great analogy, and the software world has adapted a lot of these kind of lean methodologies and analogized them. Instead of a widget, you have a ticket, right?
But it's much more than just Kanban.
Oh, sure. That's just an example of a term that comes from Toyota, right? And it's much more holistic than that. No, I totally understand that. In terms of examples, I think the best example, and maybe the funniest example, is I was working with a CTO of a company, and I asked him, I said, how are you going to scale this? And he said, well, we're just going to hire a lot of PhDs. I mean, this was a serious conversation. We're just going to hire a lot of PhDs. And I don't even want to know what look I had on my face. It was probably a horrible look, and it was probably very insulting on top of that. But I looked at him and I said, okay, so let me just assume a whole bunch of things, and let's follow your logic, right? So let's assume that money's not a problem. We have infinite money, which obviously we didn't, but let's pretend we do. Let's pretend that we can buy whatever these theoretical PhDs, want to get their work done. How many PhDs are produced around the world, to make something like this, who have the expertise? And, he's like, kind of doing the Fermi problem, right? Like, well, at my school we had this many, and, these other schools, you get the idea. And so he comes up with a number. I'm like, well, how many do you think we're going to need to make 1 million of these? And he's just looking at me like, well, wow, that's a lot of PhDs, right? And I said, assuming you have infinite money and that you could make infinite money, because you have infinite money and all this, it's not a problem. Profit's not a problem. You can't even make PhDs fast enough, right? And so he looked at me. He's like, yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, And so then our conversation was able to shift right after that, significantly, thank goodness. So that's one of the things that that's one of the things that I've heard, more than once, which to a guy who worked in big companies, it's a kind of a scary thing. But I'm used to it now, and so that's one thing. That's thinking statistically. Building that one. Hey, this works. Now we're just going to make 10,000 of them, right? One of the co-founders of my company is the head of medical engineering at Caltech, and he tells me, he's like, well, Evan, scaling is the hard part, right? And I was like, well, I don't have a PhD, and I was never smart enough to get one. But he looks at me, he goes, well, let me just say this. My PhD students, they build one, and they explain how it works in writing, right? They defend it, and I give them a PhD. I said, but if I told these guys and gals that they had to build 10 before they graduated, they'd all just die. and this comes from the head of medical engineering at Caltech. And so he said, and that's the thing, is that when you build that one and it works, that's good and all. But what you really have to think about is what that one is telling you about the million that you're going to have to build later. And there's a lot of methods for that. Not everyone believes them right away, but over time, as you get people used to talking that way, thinking that way, using the math, and most PhDs have, most people with engineering degrees have enough background to understand statistics at the industrial level anyway. And then, the tough stuff you hire consultants for. But that's another thing that comes to mind. Those are like sort of two or three.
Over here.
What you just said is a perfect segue to my next question. I'm an early pioneer in computer-controlled robotics in the biomedical industry through thermogenesis. Now I have a passion for open source, and with that, open hardware. It solves part of what you just said. I never had a PhD, but I was first to market and beat with my team 2 other teams that spent millions, because the innovation was first and the team was first. Just literally the recipe that you said is what we had. I'm trying to duplicate that now, years later. This was in the 80s, with here in Pasadena promoting open source and open collaboration and open hardware. Do you see in the biomedical industry, I'm working with media right now, but my goal is to go back to biomedical, especially since it's here in Pasadena. Do you see a place for open hardware? They have open seeds now. They have open collaboration for many industries, and I'm really looking at a possibility of encouraging open collaboration and open hardware here in Pasadena, because it does bring in people like me that don't have a PhD along with Caltech. To me, I see that as crucial. I'd love to hear your perspective on the industry about that.
I think the open source thing is a great thing, and I think it could happen in medical devices. The challenge, and I have this like backup slide here, is this piece, regulatory strategy, right? Because open source is not validated in the same way as you would. Can you imagine, your pacemaker? I mean, not that you have a pacemaker, but a pacemaker. The software that runs that being open source, and you put it in, you're just like, yeah, it seems to work. Let's go, right? I mean, there's a different level of validation needed, particularly for life saving. Da Vinci robot comes to mind, given that you were in robotics. So it's one of these things where I think it's great because it speeds up the process of development, particularly on the software side. But then, the piece you got to sort of add back to what doesn't exist in most open source environments is the regulatory piece and the validation piece that might be a challenge, because you didn't write all the code.
Right, but I was familiar with ISO 9000 and so you don't kill people through medical devices.
Oh, totally, yeah. In medical devices, there's a flavor of ISO 9000 called ISO 13485. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for your talk. I'm a technology guy who got stuck in medical device marketing. So I'm just curious, when do you think it's appropriate to bring in sort of the marketing voice into this process? My experience has been when our clients are getting close to clearance, then all of a sudden they go, oh, we should name this product. We should start to think about how we're going to communicate message around it. But I'm curious when you think ideally to bring in kind of the professional marketing perspective into this process.
What amazes me about your story is that they got investors to buy into this without a good marketing story. But that's my first reaction to that. I guess I'll go back to this chart so I can just point. I think it starts very, very early, right? I mean, even if you look at FDA requirements, they say you've got to get your user needs in place. That's the first thing you got to do. And they use that term user needs. I mean, it's regulated that way. You can call it marketing. You can call it user need. You can call it whatever you want, right? But at the end of the day, it's what is the patient, what is the doctor, what does the payer want, you know? And then I guess I'll flip back to my very last slide. Oops. Yeah. You know, the thing that's complicated about medical devices is you don't just have customers. I mean, iPhones, you just have customers, right? But here you've got practitioners. You've got to convince the doctor to use whatever you've dreamed up in your lab. You've got to convince the insurance companies or a Kaiser Permanente, which is like a practitioner and insurance company in one, to pay for it. Because if you don't have what we call a CPT code, which is to say your doctor can just say, hey, I did a procedure 1023, whatever, and they send it into the insurance company, and the insurance company pays, you're kind of hosed. I mean, there's a few exceptions to that, right? Cosmetic surgery is one very, very notable exception. LASIK surgery wasn't insured for the longest time. And so, and those industries, particularly in LA, are very good. But you've got to convince a lot of different people. So that marketing strategy should inform your product development, because at the end of the day, the engineers have got to deliver what the market wants. So at the beginning, I would also say that at the beginning, you're not sitting there heavily trying to sell it out in the marketplace, because you don't have anything to sell yet. I mean, what happens if you try to sell it and they give you a check? You're like, hey, we just started, But yeah, there's involvement at the beginning, and then of course it's very, very heavy after approval, because now the very, very hard work starts. That's sort of the manufacturing part of marketing, right?
I love how you've done such a good job of making this applicable to a bunch of different industries. I'm curious, as you're doing this design for manufacturing or design for distribution loop, how do you differentiate between something that's just a stumbling block and something that may be an indication you need to start over?
Holy cow, if I had a formulaic answer to that, I'd be very, very wealthy. I hate to tell you, this is the only answer I have, unfortunately, but it's really experience and feel. I mean, those of you who are engineers, by the way, feel free to chime in, because I don't have like this amazing formulaic answer. It really is has a lot to do with feel, because you've been through this before, and I love cars, so I'll make a race car analogy. Like if someone tells you can take this corner at 90 miles an hour or something like that, and you try and you're like, oh, I got to 80, okay, now you get to 82, you might take someone taking you in your car and going around that corner at 90, so you know what it feels like, like in your gut, right? As opposed to, well, I understand the physics and the tires have this much stick, and it's a gut feel thing, right? And I think that's kind of where it is, and the more it's, or like a doctor, right? Like you want to go to a doctor with a lot of experience, because he or she has seen all these cases, and then can just intuit things that a less experienced doctor would have to sit there and consult with 100 different people before they figured it out. So unfortunately, that's the best answer I have.
Hey, Evan, got a question. Can you go back to the slide where you have that idea and scalability, and then you become, I think that one, no, it wasn't that one. But anyways, I'll ask my question. That's just kind of two questions. One, you're helping people with an idea have that become reality. So basically, like you use the example, a napkin, drawing, and then coming up with a prototype. Can you talk about, that was a slide I was referring to. Two things. One, from a fundraising standpoint, because you go through all of this, you come to the product, and then you talk about manufacturing, scalability. Well, what you need for all of this is money. And so now, you bring all this to potential investors. Some of the challenges or advice or obstacles that you've run into or seen from a fundraising standpoint. And then the second question, if you can talk a little bit about outsourcing, because a lot of companies now are outsourcing as opposed to, unless it's technology like nanotechnology, where they may have to create a proprietary manufacturing process to create something. We talk a little bit about those two concepts. Sorry.
Absolutely. So the first is fundraising. So we're in the middle of I've got a different deck that is like my company's pitch, and right now we're in the middle of reformulating that deck to answer entrepreneurs' questions about how we can support their value inflection points. There's a great book by Fred Haney, and I can't remember the title, I can look it up on my phone, but I'll do that later. But anyway, there you have to understand in the investor community where the value inflection points are. For medical devices, it's typically, you may be able to get some angel funding if you've got some kind of prototype concept kind of thing that proves that the science is real. After that, then you've got to prove that it works in something other than a bench, maybe. Depends on the investor, of course. I mean, there are investors who are out there that just have a mission, right? And so what they do is they'll fund something even though they don't know 100% that it'll make money. They hope that it will, and they can help it make money. But they'll do it because they feel like, well, this is going to help this constituent, like the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, JDRF. So you've got to be conscious of where your development, where your technical development can match with value inflection in your industry. It's different for pharmaceuticals than it is for devices by a lot, by the way. And it's different for different classes of device. Your competitive landscape matters because if somebody's already got something, then let's say company A has already purchased a startup and it's on the market, you might be able to get a better deal if you're in that space and you're going to help company B competing with company A answer that competitive threat. So you've got to understand those value inflection points and where the development matches with those. Can you repeat your second? Scalability. Outsourcing, right. Outsourcing, what I would say is that outsourcing is a lot like this, right? So you replace teaming with outsourcing. You got to decide whether it's available, whether you got to develop it inside or whether you can acquire it. That changes a little bit. You decide whether you do it in-house or outside of the house. The thing that I tend to think about and I advise my clients on is to answer the question, what makes you different, right? Because if making printed circuit boards doesn't make you different, just go buy them online from Screaming Circuits or whatever, right? But on the other hand, if you're in the business of making that really, really different and better and it gives you that competitive advantage in the market, then maybe you do want to build it in-house, in which case, on the sort of backup slide at the bottom I have intellectual property. Now you have to decide whether you go patent it and then basically publish it to the world and get a lock on it for 17 or whatever years, or whether you keep it a trade secret like a Coca-Cola does. Because if you're Coca-Cola and you patent the formula, you're done, right? That kind of thing. So that's how I would sort of address that. You've got to think about strategically why you're outsourcing and who you're going to outsource it to, and then you've got to figure out how everything fits together. It's kind of analogous or similar to hiring and building a team.
Question back here.
Hello, Joel Eiffel. It's actually not a question, it's just a response to the previous question. I run an aerospace startup, much like medical devices, high risk, and your question is around when do you start over or continue on the path? There's a few things I find that a lot of people don't do. First is having great product requirements documents, which is where you note all your assumptions and key quantitative information about the product. That at least gives you a metric of, are we meeting these? The second one would be a PFMEA or failure mode effect.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we just do questions right now?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is there a question?
We'll talk later. No. Nice to see you, Evan.
Hey, Joel.
Thank you. So you deal a lot with the question over here? Okay, sorry about that. The company that you're dealing with right now, or the company that you're with right now, has to do with medical devices, right? Can you talk a little bit about clinical trials, costs and all that's involved with getting approval from the FDA?
Yeah, that's a very large area to talk about. In general, the way it works is, you prove something on the bench, you prove a whole bunch of them on the bench, you get to the point where you feel like, okay, well, we can put it into an animal model. Nobody that I know in the industry likes animal models, but it's a fact of life. And then, if you've proven it in an animal, then there's a bunch of other tests too, like biocompatibility and whatnot. And then you can launch clinical trials, which is human trials. Depending on whether it's pharma, which I have like zero expertise in, or a device, they allow you, the FDA and other regulatory bodies allows you to then do what we call more or less a phase 1 trial, essentially, it's phase one is kind of like the first part of the Hippocratic Oath, right? Like first do no harm. So you got to prove it. It's not going to mess anything up. And you've already proven it on the bench. You've proven it in animals, and then you can then go into humans and prove that it does no harm. You're not expected to have a signal of efficacy at that point, meaning you don't have to prove that it really works. You hope that you have some indication that it'll work, but that doesn't always happen. And then from there, once you've proven that, then you can then go into larger and larger trials and then into the market. Sometimes, going on the backup slide, your regulatory strategy and your path to market, you may have to do something like, Edwards Life Sciences, Orange County, great example. They have a new valve for the heart. You don't need to crack your chest open for it. It's called a transcatheter heart valve. And they make an incision in your groin, come up the femoral artery, and then around the aorta, and the valve, by the way, it's like origamied up into this tiny little thing. They make a 0.5 centimeter, I think, incision, and then they drop it off. It unfurls and then pushes your valve to the side, and then it just starts working. It takes like 20 or 30 minutes to do this procedure. Pretty amazing, right? So what they did was that they proved that it worked on the bench, proved it worked in animals, and then went and found the highest risk patients, meaning the worst thing that could happen is that, they're going to die, right? That's how the first heart valve worked. It's like, hey, you're going to die tomorrow. Would you like to try this? I know that's very morbid, right? But that's a fact. And that's the only way you're going to do it ethically, right? And so what they do is they applied for a humanitarian device exemption and say, hey, look, these folks are kind of done for. Can we try it in these folks first? And you go there, you prove it, and you extend the window. Hey, this works for 30 days, 60 days, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. That's the kind of path that sometimes you have to take for clinical trials. It's a lot easier for non-invasive devices. If you make a device that just puts some light on your skin and then detects your oxygen level, like you have on your finger when you go to the doctor. Those clinical trials are super easy, right? Because you're not going to ever hurt anybody. You could have that on for hours and hours, days and days, and nothing bad ever happens to you except you get a bunch of readings, right? And from there, you have other medical devices that are sort of in between. So surgical tools, for example, one that goes into your brain and does some surgery or does some cutting or whatever. Those are kind of in between those two extremes. Is that what you were looking for? Okay.
Next question's right up here. Yeah, hi. I just want to go back. You're talking about engaging the payers in the healthcare system. Because the question, when you meet the providers, they'll say, who's going to pay? And you say the payers. And then when you meet the payers, who's going to pay for this? They'll say the providers. So kind of just want to get your insight of that process on the marketing from the healthcare system, engaging the payers. Who's going to buy the device or the service?
There is kind of a catch-22. That landscape has changed a lot in the last 10, 20 years, right? Because especially in this country, I should say, because there's this notion that we all know that our healthcare is too expensive. So now there are times when you can go to a hospital system and say, hey, look, this is going to save you a lot of money, right? And as long as the MD, who's their CFO, agrees, then all the doctors have to use it. There's that. In some countries, you need approval from their national health care system, right? Great Britain is a great example, national health, the NHS there. You get an approval from NHS, and it's usable in all of Britain. Now then you have to also convince the doctors. So you do have to do them kind of simultaneously in a way, because it really sort of, they build on each other.
Backing up to your graph there with knowledge and design freedom, you say that that one. Do you have any history? Do you know how your professor came up with that graph?
To be honest with you, I don't think he came up with the graph. I think he got it from somewhere, and I don't know where.
I think that tells a lot of the story right there.
I think this is my favorite graph in the whole world. I feel like this is an expression of life.
I don't think so.
Like, you have a kid, it's like, oh man, I don't know what to do. You're at the end, you're like, oh, he's already grown up.
Evan, one last question. So right now, we've had some talks from other speakers about connected devices, especially with smartphone these days, and then sensors, and because you kind of talked a little bit about that right before you answer the question from this gentleman, are you seeing a lot of that new technology in that area as far as connected devices, health tech devices, and things like that as kind of a new wave of medical device?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of startups out there that are trying to do sensing in the body. So they want to stick something in you and leave it there, and then read to your phone. There's data privacy concerns there. HIPAA is very, very important and all that. But in terms of the devices themselves, yeah, there's a lot of activity, and they're trying to detect glucose. You've got Dexcom, which has that people are trying to improve on that, so they can just have it in for longer, give you more accurate readings, more real-time readings. There's a company up in the Bay Area that's doing pressure. They're sensing. They inject a little thing into your eye, and then it detects the pressure inside for glaucoma. And they can just leave it there, and you just have your phone nearby, and you're good. And from time to time, you want to wave a wand in front of it to charge the little battery inside or whatever. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. And one day we're gonna be all loaded up with sensors, I'm sure.
Just put an Alexa in your eye. Thanks, Evan. Please give a round of applause for Evan. So informative. I want to get a photo of you, and actually, I have a last question. So you've given us so much insight. You did a very broad level, and then with the Q&A, you went into a lot of detail. Thank you for that. Is there anything that us as a group and a community here in Pasadena of lots of innovators and entrepreneurs, is there anything we can do to help you?
Oh man. Come see me in East Pasadena with an idea and funding, right?